everyone. I welcome you to the 40th seminar of the International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress Seminar Series, Phase 3, organized by the Global South Network. I would like to start the session by thanking the organizer of this weekly seminar series, Dr. Noman Riyad, lecturer in law, Leicester Law School, the founder and convener of the Global South Network. I am Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal. I will be chairing today's session. I'm an associate professor of South Asian history at the Department of History at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, where I teach courses in the history of the modern world, South Asian history, and Islam in the modern world. As a historian of modern Kashmir, I'm the author of Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation, which examines how the Indian and Kashmir governments utilized state building to entrench India's colonial occupation of Kashmir in the aftermath of partition. Today we have two discussants. The first discussant is Dr. Saeed Bagheri, who is a lecturer in international law at the University of Reading School, or Reading, sorry for my American pronunciation, School of Law. Prior to joining the University of Reading, Dr. Bagheri was a Max Weber postdoctoral research fellow at the European University Institute from 2017 to 2019. He's the author of International Law and the War with the Islamic State, Challenges for Jus ad Bellum and Jus in Bello. Dr. Bagheri's scholarship has been cited by academic resources and official documents, including by the House of Lords of the United Kingdom, the Law Council of Australia's submission, and the German Federal Parliament. The second discussant is Dr. Andrea Maria Pelliconi, who's a lecturer in the School of Law, University of Southampton. Andrea's research focuses on demographic engineering and its social and human rights impact under international law. She specializes in human rights, migration, and international criminal law. Andrea will join us in the second half of the session and share her thoughts based on her understanding of the slides and the abstract. Pietro Stefanini is the peer commentator for today's session. He's a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Edinburgh. His research explores the historical and contemporary relationship between humanitarianism and settler colonialism through the case of Palestine and Israel. Last but not least, our guest speaker for today's session is Arbaz Muzaffer, who is currently a final year doctoral researcher at the Birmingham Law School, University of Birmingham. His research is funded by the Midlands Four Cities Arts and Humanities Research Council. He examines the right to self-determination under international law, specifically investigating the potential expansion of its scope in post-colonial contexts, with a focus on the colonially rooted conflict in Kashmir. In addition to his research endeavors, Arbaz serves as a postgraduate teaching associate at Birmingham Law School, where he instructs courses on decolonizing legal concepts and legal solutions. He's also a licensed legal practitioner authorized to appear before the High Court of Jammu and Kashmir. Arbaz will present his project titled Evaluating Demographic Engineering and Forced Integration Within International Law, Kashmir and Palestine's Parallel Narratives. Arbaz, you have 30 to 35 minutes for the presentation, which will be followed by 5 minutes each for comments and questions of the discussant and the peer commentator, and also 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers from the members of the audience. The floor is now yours. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. Start discussing about, demographic engineering or forced integration. The first thing that comes into our mind would be, where do we start? Do we start in Palestine? Do we start in Kashmir? Do we start in many other parts of the, contemporary, this global order? But here, what I do want to do is I want to address two of the most, I can say, protracted and painful struggles of Kashmir and Palestine. Now, these are the regions that, though separated by continents, they share an unfortunate and an enduring, connection. Now, both of them, they are trapped in the lingering webs of colonialism. They are forced into repression, and they are still relentlessly fighting for their right to self-determination. Now, their stories are a testament to more than just the territorial disputes or mere religious conflicts that they are often relegated to. Now, instead, what they have become is more emblematic of a more serious issues. They're dealing with the colonial legacies, they're dealing with human rights violence, They're dealing with their state sovereignty that was taken away from them, and again, their right to self determination. Now, their stories nonetheless intertwine across the lines of history and politics. The betrayals of that sovereignty that they had, that they lost, the historical title that they lost, it's rooted in colonialism. And their current occupiers employing modern, or should I say, rather deplorable tactics that are largely, if not completely, reminiscent of the colonial rule that would suppress the local indigenous population or the local population of those regions. Now, what this has done, this has turned them into symbols of persistent institutionalized injustices as the world watches rather helplessly. Look at Gaza right now, look at West Bank and Palestine right now, and look at Lebanon right now. The immunity with which this colonizer, the occupier, has been committing the crimes, this is setting a very dangerous precedent. Counterpart with regards, this is setting a rather dangerous precedent counterpart with regards to other similar situations. If we talk about Kashmir for that matter, while innocent civilians, men, women, children, they are caught in this unending spiral of bloodshed, displacement, and disenfranchisement, the international community and so called superpowers, they seem to be on the sides of the occupiers right now. Or should I say, the new colonizers. The aim here is to delve into the ongoing geopolitical context and the converging policies that keep both and Palestine under the shackles of foreign control. Now, what I try to do is I try to explore not only the powers that these occupying states, the occupiers, are unleashing on these regions, but more importantly, the failures of the international community to at least positively respond or react to the crisis that's undergoing. To begin with, I don't think there is much to be discussed in terms of the historical context that discussed every now and then. Every time we start discussing about these conflicts and the wars, the violence that's perpetrated, we start going back to doing the historical analysis. Now, in this case, I'll just give a brief context of what do I mean when I say that Kashmir and Palestine, we can draw some parallel narratives. The imprints of the British imperialism, they are deeply embedded in both the conflicts. And Palestine, they became victims of British geopolitical strategies and imperial ambitions in the 20th century, in the start of 20th century. Now, these regions, they were rich in history and culture. They were subjected to the whims of colonial powers who redrew boundaries and made decisions without considering the aspirations of the people living there. Share these striking historical similarities in their experiences under the imperial and colonial rule. Prior to British colonial domination, both regions enjoyed, they had the varying degrees of we can say local autonomy under two of the last Muslim empires, large Muslim empires, I must say. Not, I wouldn't go to the extent saying that they were great or they were not great, but large Muslim empires. Palestine under the Ottoman Empire and Kashmir under the Mughal Empire. Their peripheral locations, even though they are situated far off from the central rule of the Ottoman Empire and Mughal Empire, it also rendered direct control expensive and difficult. And for the British, for the matter, if we start discussing about Kashmir and Palestine in relation to the British rule, again, the peripheral location within these empires, they also rendered direct control expensive and difficult. Now, what did it do? It further contributed to the autonomous status that they had, even during the Ottoman Empire or during the British rule. Now, this autonomy in with matter, in relation to Kashmir, it was gradually undermined during British rule, which marked the beginning of demographic changes in both regions. Now, most notably, the growing influence of Jewish settlers in Palestine, starting 1917 Balfour Declaration, and Hindus in Kashmir. Now, in both cases, the departing British colonial authority, they played a pivotal role in shaping the political futures of these territories, albeit through different mechanisms. In Palestine, again, like I said, creation of Israeli state through United Nations Resolution 181 in 1947. Despite the fact despite the fact neither the United Nations nor the British had possessed legal sovereignty over the region, they were administering it, and it laid the foundation for a deeply contested partition. When we talk about, despite not being part of the British India proper, Jammu and Kashmir, like many other princely states, it was meant to have the option to accede to either India or Pakistan. The option of freedom, the option of independence, the option of forming its own sovereign territory was not given at the time of partition. Now, when we talk about the consequences, We talked about what happened until partition with regards to Palestine, with regards to Kashmir. Now, what were the consequences? Now, both Palestine and Kashmir, they are different in history with regards to their historical and geopolitical context, but they do share profound similarities. Because the conflicts are rooted in colonial legacies, and they are territorial disputes to an extent. Why? Because they demand their territory, they demand the sovereignty that they had at one point of time in the past, which was taken away from them. No, Palestine under Ottoman rule for centuries, it was a multi-ethnic, multi-religion, multi-religious region where Jews, Christians, Muslims, they did coexist. Now, what happened after Balfour Declaration that promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine? It was issued without consulting the indigenous Arab majority over there, which set the stage for the conflict later on. Similarly, in Kashmir's conflict, it is rooted in the British partition of 1947. Like I mentioned earlier, it divided the subcontinent into India and Pakistan and the princely state of Kashmir. It had a Muslim majority population but had a Hindu ruler. It was caught between these two nations. So the Maharaja's alleged decision to accede to India, and the pressure that was put forward by both the countries, and the alleged tribal invasion from Pakistan, all of these situations, all of these circumstances, they made sure that so in both the cases, local populations, they remained caught in the cycles of violence, they remained caught in the cycles of repression, and ultimately political marginalization. Now, despite the international community's recognition for their struggles, the geopolitical considerations often overshadow their plight. Now, Palestinians and Kashmiris, they continue to fight for their right to self-determination. There's no denial about that fact. They continue to fight for their sovereignty, but both the conflicts remain unresolved. And to be honest, looking at how the situation currently is progressing, it does not seem that any such, prospective resolution is, in our sights. Now, when we talk about the freedom struggles in both Palestine and Kashmir, they did predate the pivotal events of 1947-48, when both of these regions were subject to partition. The creation of Israel, it entrenched the settler colonialism in Palestine, while the partition of Indian subcontinent was stuck in a myriad negotiations over power sharing in the post-colonial India. So mainly both the Palestinian and Kashmiri issues, they became some of the earliest matters of debate in the newly formed United Nations at that point of time. Now, it reflects their shared stories of colonization, dispossession, and ongoing struggle for self determination. Now, over the last 2 decades, India and Israel have forged increasingly stronger geopolitical ties. On the surface, the two countries may seem dissimilar, India being portrayed as a secular democracy with a Hindu majority population, and Israel a Jewish state. But however, when we talk about this, this narrative, it often oversimplifies the complex historical, political, and social dimension of these conflicts, reducing them to a binary struggle between the good and evil. If I do not want to, but I have to quote Netanyahu when he said this is the fight between the children of the darkness and children of the light. So this is what we can infer. This is how it has been inferred. These conflicts have been relegated to this, this fight between good and evil. Ideological overlap. This has grave implications for the people of both Kashmir and Palestine. Now, in both the cases, the local populations, the Kashmiris and the Palestinians, they are perceived as barriers to this realization of the nationalist visions that we discussed earlier. Now, as a result, what happens? They become marginalized, they become vilified, and they are subjected to policies that are aimed at altering the demographic and cultural landscape of their regions. In Israel, for instance, the expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is a key tool of demographic engineering. Since 1967, successive Israeli governments, they have encouraged the growth of these settlements, providing settlers, those illegal settlers, with government support. They are providing them with subsidies and security, for that matter. If we look at the videos coming out of Gaza right now, or sorry, West Bank right now, or many other parts of Palestine right now, we can see how they are being those illegal settlers, how they are being provided security to settle illegally in Palestinian lands. So these settlements, they're considered illegal under international law, and they have displaced Palestinians. What it has done has they have expropriated their land, they have restricted their access to essential resources like water, for that matter, and The Israelis' separation wall, it further fragments the Palestinian territories thereafter and making the establishment of a viable Palestinian state increasingly remote. So this is one effect of this demographic engineering. When you settle your people and you make sure that what will happen after this demographic engineering, if they are not, if you're not able to forcibly integrate the people, you do this demographic engineering, what happens? The idea of a viable state of Palestine, it starts to get a bit blurry. So this creating facts on the ground strategy is aimed at solidifying Israeli control over the occupied territories. So what happens? It effectively changes the demographic and political landscape in Israel's favor. Now, moving further, when we talk about these settler, colonialism tactics, the experiences of both Kashmir and Palestine, they present a compelling study, in the dynamics of settler colonialism. They reveal, strikingly, we can say, similar trajectory characterized by systematic alteration of demographics and displacement of indigenous populations. In both the contexts, state-sponsored policies and legal frameworks, they have facilitated process of the de facto annexation. It's in Palestine, for instance, Israeli strategy has evolved from what was once termed as creeping annexation to a more aggressive form of territorial control, which is characterized as a leaping annexation right now. So this is evident in extensive legal and physical infrastructures which are supporting Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem for that matter. So the authorities in Israel, they have implemented measures such as extending national laws and civil authority to occupy territories. They have started issuing declarations of permanent sovereignty and intensifying the establishment and expansion of Jewish settlements. This approach aims not only to secure a Jewish demographic majority in Jerusalem, but also to marginalize the Palestinian population through various means, including demographic, gerrymandering and the revocation of residency rights for Palestinians who temporarily leave the city for education or work. Where does and that take us? The legal frameworks, they coincide. We can collate them together. We can compare them together. The legal frameworks established by Israel in the West Bank and India in Kashmir, they demonstrate this again, striking similarity. I keep mentioning this striking similarity because it is that similar when we look at the broader picture, when we look at both Israel and India, Kashmir and Palestine, when we keep them hand to hand basically. So in the case of Israel, the government has developed a legal structure that facilitates de facto annexation by redefining this land ownership and acquisition under the guise of security and legality. Notably, there are many court cases such as Abu Hilu, Beit al-Tobas, and Elon More. They illustrate how Israeli courts have upheld government claims over Palestinian land, effectively prioritizing state interests over individual rights. So the manipulation of legal principles is evident in the loopholes exploited, by former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, if who distinguished between private and public land ownership in the Hague Convention by focusing on the state land and assigning land ownership disputes to Israeli military tribunals rather than civilian courts. Israel has facilitated this systematic expropriation of Palestinian territory while diverting criticism regarding its de facto annexation, legal and human rights violations. I really don't think there is a need to discuss too much about, because we're seeing what's happening right now in Palestine, in Gaza, in Lebanon. There's not much to add over here. Where does this leave us? These legal frameworks, this demographic engineering, this supposedly forced integration governing the actions of Israel in Palestine and India in Kashmir, they reveal a disturbing alignment in how both the states leverage law as a tool of power to sustain their settler colonial agenda. In both the contexts, law is manipulated not as a means of promoting justice or upholding human rights, but as an instrument that facilitates the annexation of territory and marginalization of the indigenous or the local population over there. Now, despite the clear violation of international law and widespread condemnation, both the countries, they continue to operate with a sense of impunity, functioning as if they were law-abiding sovereign states rather than colonizing powers. The systems of law in both the countries, they are designed to protect and support state interests over indigenous rights, over local rights of people of Palestine and Kashmir, offering scant protection to resistance movements that challenge those colonial practices. Now, In Palestine, the rapid expansion of the Israeli settlements and establishment of this dual legal system, they have created a reality that many observers, they characterize it as worse than apartheid. The absence of this effective enforcement mechanism within international law, it exacerbates the situation as there is little global political will to hold these states accountable for these actions. To end, the parallels between these situations highlight an urgent need for concerted action. I do feel that we are way past now discussing these issues in light of international law, in light of what's happening. Everything is before our eyes. What do we need to do more about it? We see that right now in Gaza, we see that right now in Palestine. Just as the international community has a responsibility to respond to the situation in Palestine as urgently as possible, it must also take into consideration, it must also take action for the time to see. But right now, the imperative of global solidarity is clear. Without immediate intervention, without advocacy for the rights of the people, rights of the people of those regions in Palestine, for prioritizing Palestine right now, where these legal frameworks, they continue to suppress their aspirations for justice and right to self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arbaz, for that excellent presentation. And now we'll be moving on to our discussants and then finally the peer commentator. So I would now like to invite Dr. Saeed for your comments and questions.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Arbaz. It was really interesting. Well, as a public international lawyer, it's always, interesting to me, to myself, that just listening to something like this that is just quite, a timely topic, and of course from absolutely different perspective. But again, I think it's part of your PhD, and congratulations on that. I just took my notes and probably just 3, 4, 5 points that I'll try to mention, but feel free to take your notes, and if you want to answer just shortly after that. Let me start with the very basics. I think it's more about some key points. Actually, you just mentioned your research. First of all, you're dealing with demographic engineering, forced integration, and settler colonialism. I think that would be much better to start with providing some definitions from a legal perspective, because I know your audience, perhaps not all lawyers, they want to understand what exactly you're referring to in your research. So this is my first point. So the second point that I just wanted to mention, you were talking about partition and its consequences. Again, you're talking about lots of things, but I guess you're an international lawyer. That would be helpful to consider some legal and policy implications. So, because basically you're comparing two different cases, which both are really important and always timely, specifically right now that the war in Gaza is just ongoing. So this is my second point, probably just you consider some policy implications for future as well. And so next point, which is a little bit a technical issue. Again, as a lawyer, I'm sure that you know that, but probably just something, sort of, a structural point. You mentioned legal and human rights violations. Just have a little bit, Dr. And I'm trying to understand what do you understand from legal and human rights? Because basically human rights is part of law. So my question is, do you talk about something rather than international human rights law, something like international humanitarian law or the use of force, or something that, as part of international law that are basically that are being violated, for example, in the last 1 year, we say, in Gaza. So this will be helpful just to clarify in your research that what you mean by legal and human rights violations. One more issue that, again, you just basically is just your central argument. You talk about self-determination. These two groups of people have been denied at international level. Of course, from national level as well, but you said at the international level as well. I don't think that it is correct, because you have generalized the international community, the state members of the international community, because we have lots of, the huge number of states that, for example, roughly about 140 states who recognize the legal states of Palestine. So they do agree that they have a right to self-determination. So my recommendation is to just try to be careful about using your language and words that not the entire international community. Of course, you're talking about some, as you said, the new countries, let's say powers like the US and the UK, that they still providing support with Israeli government. So I think, yeah, that would be helpful. That would be useful just to be clear about your language. And of course, it's also helpful that to consider two groups of states, members of the international community, those who support the right to self-determination and those who have denied this right and come with their own approach. For example, what is the approach that is coming from the UK or the US government? So that's my I just want one last point again. It's just about international law has probably is something I got from your abstract actually, but of course I was listening to your presentation. I feel a little bit, it was a contradiction in your abstract and in your presentation. You said that international law has maintained a silent attitude. Again, I don't agree because it is not about the international law itself. I think it's mostly about how the international community, dealing with international law. I don't think that we have a gap in international law. We don't have any gap in international rules. The problem is how the international community applied the law in different operational contexts. And as you see that we have lots of examples, but a very timely example is just what happened roughly about 3 years ago when the Russians invaded Ukraine, and you can also consider that what happened when the Western countries, society, they're dealing with this case, and then immediately after that, last year, when the war started in Gaza, we can see that there's a double standards. So that's my point. That again, you just need to be careful about that. So I would say that international law has not been, as silent. Actually, it's just not about international law. It's just about how the states dealing with international law. I will stop here and hope just for helpful. But feel free if you want to answer any of these points. Thank you.
I respectfully agree to all of your suggestions. They are, I wouldn't question any of those suggestions. But see, when this whole thing between Israel and Palestine happened last year in October 7, starting October 7, what happened was I used to read a lot about international law being pointless. So everybody used to comment, everybody used to write about how international law is not helping at all. That makes everybody think that do you really think there's a gap in international law that's not covering this aspect of violence? I do agree with you. International law is not pointless, but at the same time it's not flawless as well. Now, when I say it's not flawless as well, what I mean is, again, you mentioned about international community. More than 100 states, they recognize Palestine. India, for that matter, it recognized Palestine as well. Why is the genocide of Palestinians happening again? The same annexation of the land. When annexation of land happens, right to self-determination is no longer evident. So this is where my question, my question rose. I'm trying to answer this question. This is still a research in the making, and these are just preliminary, questions that came up in my mind and that I'm trying to answer, that I raised today as well. So these questions do arise, and I'm trying to answer them. But I'm so glad that you gave these suggestions. I'll work on them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Andrea for your comments and questions.
Right. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So I had to start with an apology because, as you probably have mentioned at the start, I haven't been able to join your presentation today for other commitments. So I just joined you at 3:30. So I'm very sorry I couldn't, listen to your presentation. I did read your abstract and went through your slides. So again, I apologize if my comments will be perhaps not helpful because you may have as well already covered them during your presentation, but I will, just give you my thoughts based on what I read in the abstract and the PowerPoint. And I also want to say I'm very, very excited to hear about your project, because as someone who has written her PhD herself on demographic engineering under international law, I'm absolutely thrilled to engage with your work, and I really look forward to engage more with you as well. So I think my comments really resonate quite a lot with a lot of things that Saeed has said. So first of all, in terms of the legal framework that you're using, as Saeed mentioned, you're mentioning human rights law a lot, but I do feel that, it would be very important for you to engage international criminal law to one extent, and to, engage the eliminationist rationale of demographic engineering in these two areas, and also other areas of the world, and try to think how this relates to, genocide, but also forcible transfer, and even the history of the international crime of forcible transfer. And that obviously applies also to international humanitarian law. So you could try to have a look at the history of the development of the great breaches of international humanitarian law that became forcible transfer and the crime of forcible transfer in the ICC statute. Because, and we can discuss perhaps about this more, but I think there is a lot there to unpack as to why eventually we have these specific crime frames as such, and then we have the crime of resettling civilians of the occupying power to occupied lands, but that's only framed in a very specific way that is deemed to apply to only a specific context, whilst there will be, from a critical perspective, there would be more to unpack as to why whether it would be more helpful to think more about demographic changing holistically and their relation to population changes on the ground, rather than focusing just specifically on that narrow definition that was eventually included in the Rome Statute. So that's one additional framework that I would suggest you to look into if you haven't done so yet. Another thing, which again is somehow related to what Saeed was saying, but it's more in line with your thoughts, I would think, is, and perhaps you have already engaged with this a lot, but thinking about how the post-Westphalian concept of sovereignty has an impact on how we see and how the so-called international community and everyone is viewing the situation in Palestine and Kashmir. And obviously, there are similar contexts, but they are also slightly different. They are, from a lot of perspectives. And we're not. Whilst we do have a lot of states that support Palestinian and recognize Palestinian statehood, and now they sit in the General Assembly, the ICJ has also clearly stated that they have the right to self-determination and so on and so forth in the advisory opinion. Well, in Kashmir, I don't even think there is such any discussion at the international level, at least, right? But if we think about the historical roots of the context, the development, as you point out as well, the development of this situation are very similar. So why is it, think about how we understand states and statehood nowadays relates to how we see territorial conflicts. And perhaps, I don't know if that's something that you want to do, but you could perhaps criticize these modern post-Westphalian understanding of sovereignty. And then perhaps the last point, again, I don't know if you have engaged a lot with the ICJ advisory opinion from the abstract and the PowerPoint. It didn't seem that you had really delved into that as of yet. Perhaps you have, but I think you might find a lot of interesting inputs there, including, you know, in the submissions by states, there are a lot of states that have actually mentioned demographic changes and the relationship between forced or enforced demographic changes and self-determination, making the explicit points about how they, you know, how demographic engineering in the context of Palestine violates not only self-determination, but, you know, a lot of other socioeconomic and cultural rights, as well as international humanitarian law norms. So I think all of this contribution can help you strengthen your points and somehow, you know, in the line of what Saeed say, sort of support the fact that actually the law does have something to, even if we want to criticize the whole international infrastructure of international law from the basics, which we can do, as I said, but even within the framework of, you know, our current modern international law, like the law is quite clear that we do have the right to self-determination. So we have to sort of actually make it happen. So that would be my inputs for you. But I really look forward to continue to engaging with you.
Thank you so much. I would like to, you know, comment in addition to what you said, like post-Westphalian sovereignty. What I think of, because I knew when I started on this chapter, this basically forms a chapter of my whole thesis. I dealt with this is not the overall, you know, PhD research project of mine, but just a chapter whereby I discuss these drawing these parallel narratives. But what I think of, I knew the moment I started writing this chapter, I knew this was going to be a Pandora's box. Many things were going to come out of it, and it was not going to be, it will not be easy for me to, you know, try to bring in every single thing, every single aspect, but I will try to make it as, you know, comprehensive as I can. When we talk about this, you know, the concept of sovereignty in the post-colonial context, when we talk about the state building for that matter, like I mentioned, the concept of uti possidetis juris, it was relentlessly used in, you know, during decolonization. The states were created with absolute disregard to the local population, to the ethnic composition, to the religious composition, to you know, even the tribal composition. If you look at you know, the African continent. So this state building process, this post-colonial or this decolonial state building process was already having that colonial. They already had that colonial project in the mind. That's what I kind of argue. So when we talk about the sovereignty in the post-colonial context, I believe it is, again, it's not pointless, it's not flawless either. So there are many shortcomings in that state building, in the post-colonial state building. I'm trying to explore each and every one of them. We'll see how much I can do about it. So I will definitely keep your suggestions in mind. I look forward to working on them as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrea, and also for Arbaz. We have one final peer commentator, and maybe what we'll do after Pietro speaks is we'll also take 2, max 3 questions from the audience, and then Arbaz, I'll give you time at the end to make your final comments to these final comments and questions. Thank you so much. So Pietro, if you could please start. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Hafsa, and thank you, Nauman, for inviting me, and yeah, thank you, Arbaz, for this insightful presentation. I'm going to veer the conversation a bit away from international law, as my comments have more to do with settler colonialism as a frame of analysis and how it plays out in your research project. The first point that I would like you to consider, or I wonder whether you will give this more thought, is the question of, in your slides, you repeatedly talked about the settlements in the West Bank, the 1967 settlements, and even though you start with the historical background and you acknowledge that obviously this project began during the British Mandate, I wonder if you are going to consider that the demographic project, which seems to interest you, it was established before 1948, and so well before 1967, and so and it is also playing out not only in the West Bank but in the entirety of historical Palestine, or what we consider what we call Israel. So that was the first point. The second question is, and I appreciate learning more about the similarities between settler colonialism and the last question. So the way we can sort of roughly divide the settler colonial literature, at least on Palestine, is in the 1960s is really when Palestinians pioneered the settler colonial frame during the anti-colonial era, and this was also very prominent among the African liberation movements as a frame of analysis. Then you have in the 2000s this sort of the re-emergence and its establishment as an academic field of studies with the work of Patrick Wolf and others. So yeah, that's it for me.
Okay, great. Now we'll take a couple of questions from the attendees.
Arbaz, this is wonderful. I think most people will agree with the overarching framework of this and conclusions that you draw. I think I have a lot of questions, but those are primarily related to international law and the frameworks that you specifically use. Now, I am approaching this as a public international law person, and you know, there was a talk of, let's say, human rights law, there's talk of international humanitarian law, there's talk of international criminal law, and all of those use different norms, all of those use different conceptions, and therefore, in your chapter, when you talk about international law and international legal framework, I think it would be helpful for you to distinguish what exact framework you're talking about, just for you to be able to establish your argument in the first place, right? Then there is the question once again of, I think it's more of a scoping question, and I appreciate your comment. You mentioned that this is just one chapter in your PhD thesis. So when I was sort of listening to your presentation, I was wondering whether this is the full PhD or whether this is just one chapter, because it's that question of how much. It's a question of breadth versus depth. Do you want to look at patterns, or do you want to look at specific individual actions? For example, if you look at individual actions of forcible transfer, that's prohibited, but that's prohibited within the context of international humanitarian law that applies in the context of an armed conflict, and then you have to establish that it's an armed conflict, right? But if you're looking at a pattern, I think that's better suited for a project or a chapter like this, as opposed to going into specific actions, because what that does, if you look at specific actions as well, is it makes your argument a bit susceptible to the kind of comments that we just heard, right? That there are external aggressions and so on and so forth. So I would, and I've written quite a few other sort of comments, and I'll probably reach out to you by email to discuss some of those. But I think just a little bit of methodological and framework clarity in the beginning, and I agree with Saeed's comments about definitional issues right in the beginning would be helpful. And once again, looking at this purely from a public international law, and that too a mainstream public international law point of view, and not I'm not a scholar of TWAIL or any other approach to international law, so I have that limitation in my thinking.
Thank you so much, Samir. And Arbaz, will hear from you. Any final comments or responses?
Arbaz, just to add a comment. I mean, this fantastic presentation. I think it is not the broad lessons which we can derive from your presentation is not only applicable to Palestine and Kashmir.
Exactly.
Is globally applicable. Is applicable to the case of Sri Lanka, where the same thing happened between Sinhalese and Tamils. The same thing happened between Kurds, Iraqi Kurds, and in Iraq. It also happened during Ashraf Ghani's time and the Karzai's time between the Dari-speaking people and the Pashtun-speaking people. It is also happening there in Pakistan between the Punjabis and the Baloch in the Balochistan. So it is most of the things which you just mentioned is not only applicable to these case studies, but also globally applicable to different countries. So the colonialism is the mindset. I think in this way, it's the conclusions and the preliminary findings are very much important, and it helps us understand the issue globally. Over to you, please. Feel free to respond.
I would definitely agree with your point. I mean, when I discuss Kashmir and Palestine in light of this international law, in light of settler colonialism, or in light of the right to self-determination, I do not mean to keep it confined to Kashmir or Palestine, because when I started my PhD thesis, the first case I read about was about Kurdistan, and then I went on to discuss, read about Nigeria, the Biafra, the secession of Biafra, Katanga for that matter, Sudan, East Timor. So I do not only confine myself to this part. That's why it forms just a chapter in my thesis. It's not the overall argument that I'm trying to make. Now, when it comes to drawing parallels between Kashmir and Palestine, yes, there will always be external aggressions, will always be there, external interference will always be there. It has been in case of Palestine, it has been in case of Kashmir as well. But I like to think of it as, most of us, all of these questions, they crop up, and that makes you kind of draw this equivalence between other settler colonial projects elsewhere in the world, and Palestine for this matter. So this is still a project in continuation. Is still a project in practice right now. I'm trying to read more about it.
Thank you again, Arbaz, and to our discussants, as well as all the attendees and participants.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Look after yourself. Have a great day. See you next week, same time.
Very interesting session. Thank you.